father, the emotions in this fight were completely different. Everything was completely different without my father. I was offered the fight right after everything happened. I had the decision to accept it or turn it down. Nobody knew about this, or retire, or I could come back, fight, and then retire. Now I tell people close to me that aren't happy with me retiring that even if I fought 10 more times, I'd still have to face that decision. This decision could come up when I'm 32, 34, 35. It's a hard decision because I've been fighting all my life. I've been on mats for as long as I remember. It's difficult to leave and do something else. People can't understand it, but what can you do? And with that, welcome to Early Stoppage, a show where the news of the day is usually given just enough time, but sometimes not enough. If this is your first time stopping by, we thank you. And get ready for something you won't find anywhere else. I'm John Franklin. I'm joined as always by the Godfather of Fight Night Picks, Craig Allen. Craig, how are you?
John, I'm well. I spent today being Remembrance Day in Canada, remembering, and I salute you with Veterans Day in the United States. I will tip my cap to you. Yeah, I mean, you guys have what? You have Memorial Day and Veterans Day?
Yes.
We just have Remembrance Day, the one holiday there today. But I did spend my Remembrance Day with Matt Allen, another portion of Fight Night Picks, the lesser portion, the portion that doesn't own this trophy. For now, he's catching up. But overall, we spent today kind of going over, a bit of a blueprint for the rest of the year for Fight Night Picks, kind of some of the things that we're looking to add, put out those individual videos. But there's a lot going on. I'm really excited, and I think we've got some neat stuff coming up closer to the end of the year.
I'm excited as well. Obviously, at the end of the year, not to spoil anything because there's nothing to spoil because I've talked to you about this. But, as years wrap up, you're always doing wrap-up shows for the year. Sure, we'll get into stuff like that either on this show or others. So it's exciting. All right, Craig, on this episode of Early Stoppage, we talk Harrison being light as a feather, the short notice dragon, and Zuffa boxing. But we begin with Conor McGregor. Craig, the Notorious One, has a dance partner, Dustin Poirier, a date, January 23rd. So that means he has a fight, right? And according to media reports, he does. However, Dana White says, not so fast, my friend, and has told the media the deal is not done. Greg, all sorts of questions come out of this, but let's start with three quick ones. First, do you like the fight? Second, what do you think is holding it up? And third, is this the beginning of the Fight Night Picks Lightweight Grand Prix?
I'm going to answer three first. I wish. Don't you? We honey-dicked everybody with that thumbnail. I wish it were true. John, I'm going to throw a question back at you. In Conor McGregor's entrance, what's your favorite of the three songs that play?
Oh, the Biggie one for sure. That's it.
Okay. I like the Duran Duran. No, Notorious. If I had to answer this one, I mean, do I like this fight? Yeah, 100% I do. I think this is one of the best rematches that you can make in the sport. Do I want to see Gaethje Khabib too? Of course I do. But in this one, Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier at 155 pounds, incredibly interesting. I mean, at the time that they fought at 45, both young guys, they've established themselves. Obviously, McGregor with the featherweight interim belt, the full-time belt, the lightweight belt, and so on and so forth. For Dustin Poirier, the interim belt at 55. And for Poirier, this is a great shot to springboard yourself into the title conversation. For McGregor, it's an opportunity to kind of set aside all those bad feelings and all those, conversations that are going to come up. Well, he's just a welterweight now. He doesn't deserve a shot at a belt at 155 pounds. If he can successfully make weight and he can beat Poirier, wow. I mean, you're really cementing legacy. Does it count as winning the belt back, or does it count as an unofficial title defense? That remains to be seen. But do I like the fight? 100%. What's holding it up? That's an interesting question, because obviously Dana White coming out and saying the fact that Dustin Poirier already signed his bout agreement. We're just waiting for McGregor. I don't know, John. I mean, remember when McGregor was supposed to fight Cerrone and did fight Cerrone in January of last year? There were a lot of different legalities and questions that popped up around some investigations that were going on in Ireland. Nothing really seems to have happened with those. I wonder if they're kind of affecting this. I wonder if, again, the weight is an issue. Maybe McGregor really has a steep hill to climb to make the weight. I don't really know what's holding it up. But again, I just wish that lightweight Grand Prix would happen. But if it doesn't happen, Poirier McGregor 2, just as a standalone fight, is good enough for me.
Yeah, I like it as well. And I think that what makes it really interesting is how long it's been since they fought the first time and how different things are since they fought the first time. I mean, Dustin Poirier was the Fightville kid when he fought Conor McGregor before. His hair was buzz cutted. He was just kind of like this shot out of a cannon. What we thought was just some, Louisiana redneck kid that loved to fight. And Conor was Conor, but he wasn't like a global icon. He wasn't, they were kind of a little bit closer in terms of profile then than they are now. And, this is like most sequels suck, right? A few of them are good. But when you have a lot of space between sequels, the cool thing is to see, like we just talked about a second ago, what's changed. Conor's a little older. Poirier's a little older. There's more tattoos. There's more scar tissue, All that stuff makes this fight cool. And they happen to be pretty damn close in the rankings. And the fight will probably be better than it was the first time. So, we really get to see how far Dustin Poirier's come, how far Conor McGregor's come, what's different. They've now had an opportunity to scout each other. Poirier knows that, unlike the first fight, I can't just say, oh, this guy talks a lot of shit, and that means he can't fight. He knows he can fight because of everything he's seen since he got cracked himself. And, the one thing I haven't heard a lot of people talking about is the first fight kind of ended in a little bit of controversy. I mean, obviously Conor won it, but there was some, like, where exactly did he hit him on the head? Was it towards the back of the head? Was it an early stoppage? What exactly was it? So you like I did that. Yeah, as far as why the deal's not done, listen, Conor's the A side with everybody except for Dana. And I think that with this situation, Conor's looking for little concessions here and there. You want to give me Khabib made 10 million, I want 11. I want proper 12 in the cage, or I want a certain number of things. So Conor's gonna, if it becomes that he's gonna fight only so often, once or twice a year, and if he's not fighting in front of live crowds, he's going to squeeze this orange for all the juice he can get for it, because these fights become rare. And it's not like boxing where, you get in there and you can make, hundreds of millions of dollars. You're going to make tens of millions of dollars. So you need to make sure that if you're going to get in there and lay it on the line, you're getting every little nuance of the things that you want.
100%. He's a smart businessman, John. We're going to transition from smart business people to probably not the smartest of business people. And in an unprecedented move, and I can't prove that it's precedent actually, but in a surprise move, the PFL is allowing their fighters the freedom to fight in other promotions. Well, some other promotions. I mean, they can't fight in the UFC and they can't fight in Bellator. The first big name fighter to do this is actually going to come up in the next week or so with Kayla Harrison. So the question is, do you like this for the PFL, for Kayla Harrison, and is maybe Kayla Harrison a UFC champion in the waiting? And I should kind of add a little bit of clarity too, because she's going to be fighting in Invicta, and she's actually moving down. She was a lightweight champ in the second season of the PFL. She's actually going to take her first fight at featherweight coming up in her Invicta debut. And she said that the last time that she weighed in at featherweight at 145 pounds was when she was 17 years old.
Well, I'm sure that bodes well for this next weight cut that she's going to go through. Let me start with PFL. Why I like this for the PFL. I like it for the PFL because, listen, Lance Palmer was just the beginning of it. They were going to have some serious lawsuits on their hands if they didn't give these fighters a little bit of freedom to go do something else. And what would have happened is the fighters probably would have taken them to court. There probably would have been breach of contract, and then they would have went to the UFC or Bellator. So at least they got in front of it a little bit and said, yeah, you want to fight? Sure. Go out, make some money, just not in the UFC and Bellator. That's the one thing that we're going to put on this. This one caveat to it is going to be the biggest caveat of all, which is you can't fight in the two most relevant promotions in the world. So I do like it for Harrison because she does need to stay active. I mean, if she thinks that she's going to go to the UFC at some point and fight Amanda Nunes or Megan Anderson or whoever at 145 pounds for that belt, she's not going to do it fighting once a year. So she needs to really, I mean, as great as she is at what she does, this isn't the Ronda Rousey era where you can just be good at one thing and there's not enough women out there to compensate their inability to combat that one thing with throwing other things at you. There's a wide skill set of women out there now. Maybe not 145 pounds. Maybe that one hasn't quite caught up to bantamweight yet, but she can't pull that. She can't pull that fight once a year shit with Jermaine Durandamy. She can't do it with Megan Anderson. I mean, she's going to need to really, really get her reps in if she wants to fight those girls. So I do like it for Harrison. I like it for the PFL. And I do think that this is kind of setting the table for her to make her move to the UFC within the next year or so.
But to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense because when this was kind of announced, and I know Ariel Helwani had a bit of a hand in it, but you look at, I went over to the PFL's Twitter page, and as soon as it was announced, it was like, wow, the PFL tweeted out like best of luck to Kayla Harrison as she competes with Invicta. Invicta sent out a tweet, the PFL retweeted it. Ariel had something to say, the PFL would retweet it. The PFL seems to be pretty pro this move. I think this is one of their superstars. Other than Kayla Harrison, who would you consider like a PFL superstar? I mean, Lance Palmer isn't necessarily a superstar. He's a two-time millionaire and belt winner, but he's not a superstar. Natan Schultz, two-time champ, two-time millionaire, not a superstar. Their stars are like Ray Cooper III, Kayla Harrison, and who? Like Josh Copeland? Like, who do they have? Ali Asayev? He's the guy that won their heavyweight Grand Prix last year, their tournament last year. So for me, they don't really have a lot of stars. They've really hitched their wagon to Kayla Harrison, and they really seem to think that she's the big PFL star. So they have to keep her happy. I think this is more a move to keep Kayla Harrison happy and in the good graces with the PFL rather than, oh, well, I'm in Invicta, and Invicta's kind of a pipeline for potentially or possible UFC fighters. So for me, it's more of a PFL move than it is a move closer to the UFC, even though I could definitely understand where you're coming from. The other thing that I took issue with this, and when you were kind of going through your answer, I had to go back through my tweets because Ariel Helwani sent out a tweet and said PFL is allowing their fighters to go out and about. Manager Malky Kawa, for example, tells me he's seeking fights for his clients Brendan Loughnane and Justin Willis. I retweeted with a comment and said, little late for this now, eh? And Jason Burgos subtweeted or just replied and said, this is new, but when Helwani reports that it is. Usman, being Muhammad Usman, was allowed to fight elsewhere. Chris Camozzi can fight for Glory. And then he clarified it's more for the Bellators and the UFCs where he can't go. That's the thing. There's all of these fighters that raised a big issue with PFL not being able to fight. We've covered it before on this show. It's really weird. And to me, this is like way too little too late because the pandemic, let's say, started in March. We're in November and you're just now letting fighters go out and take some fights. I mean, these are people that were on that $1,000 a month. Here you go. We're still paying you. I mean, most people can't live on $1,000 a month. Fighters with their gym expenses, their training, their travel, they can't live off of that, surely. So this to me is like a last ditch effort to save face. It's like Golden Boy releasing Canelo Alvarez so everybody else doesn't freak out. It's a move like that. And it's still not a great look for them.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, and you got to wonder like who their competition is, right? Dana, I mean, they're so huge in the UFC. Dana says, my competition is the movies. My competition is Netflix. Wherever your eyes are, other than the UFC, that's my competition. And I mean, I guess Invicta's a competitor of PFL, but the PFL is kind of in a place now where it's like beggars can't be choosers. Like if we're gonna find a partner where our fighter could go, and there's a hope that they're gonna come back, it's Invicta's not a bad spot. That you could still bring, have something to draw the fighter back. All right, Craig. Glover Teixeira defeated Thiago Santos this past weekend. It was what the casuals call an impressive win. Actually, everybody calls it that. A third-round submission. Teixeira feels that he has leapfrogged Adesanya for that light heavyweight title shot with Jan Blachowicz. What say you?
100%. I mean, if you watch that fight, Glover getting rocked by Santos, coming back, that was a nail biter. Matt Allen calling the third-round submission win for Glover Teixeira. That was insane. The kid's on a roll. But I look at this as, you got a guy that's 41 years old. How many more title shots are you going to get after 41 at light heavyweight? Probably not many. He's put together an impressive win streak. Some of them not so much as others, but when you stop Anthony Smith and you stop Thiago Santos, guys that have recently challenged for the belt. And again, in our first question, talking about Poirier and McGregor, the time off between the first fight and the rematch, you look at the last time Glover Teixeira fought for a title, it's been years. So give this guy one more shot. Adesanya isn't going anywhere. And I mean, I get it. They're trying to build the Adesanya fight against Blachowicz to set up something with John Jones. Why don't you put that on a back burner and give this guy an opportunity? He just headlined a show that was less than stellar in terms of name value. It definitely delivered, as they typically always do. but he put on such an impressive performance, and you shouldn't have to make him wait, and you definitely shouldn't have to have him fight like a Rakic or anybody in that, top 7. I wouldn't make Glover Teixeira do that. I think he more than enough deserves a title shot for the performance that he put on this past weekend.
So you're going to hate my answer, but here's the deal with it. So I'm looking at it from two different perspectives. The Glover Teixeira perspective and the UFC's perspective. 100% of your Glover Teixeira, you have to push for this. Not that he wouldn't, but it's like, you just said it yourself. These title shots are few and far between. And when you get that shot, we may see Thiago Santos go away in a meaningful way. Like, he may just start to slowly, these guys have one great night.
Like Anthony Smith.
Yeah, they have one great night where they get close to greatness and they never can recapture it. There's the examples of guys like Johnny Hendricks who got close and then ultimately, became a champion, but then he sort of fell off a cliff as well. So if you're Teixeira, you know how long it's been since the last time you got this title shot. So you really have to advocate for it. Here's the problem. If you're the UFC, all due respect to these two fighters, I mean, could this be the first title shot on a prelim? Dude, these guys are all but anonymous. I mean, if there's no belt on the line, this is a fight night main event. Blachowicz and Teixeira. That's the problem. So you can't market this thing. So yeah, did Glover Teixeira earn a title shot? And again, I believe as an advocate for fighters and someone that cares about fighters moving forward, you have to say, if you're the UFC, so many things happen that when a guy earns a title shot, you got to give it to him right away. You can't be screwing around with this. And Glover Teixeira has clearly earned it. So you have to give it to him, or it may never come around again because so many things get crazy. So I guess my question for you is I mean, can it be any sort of a draw be expected for this fight? I mean, what's a number for this fight?
If you want a crazy answer, and I know they've already come out and said, yeah, Blachowicz, Adesanya, the fight's going to happen. You bring up a good point. What if you had a pay-per-view, and this is never going to happen, where you had Glover Teixeira and Jan Blachowicz in the co-main event for the belt. In the main event, you have Israel Adesanya and John Jones. 5-round fight. You have John Jones, your former longtime champ. You have Israel Adesanya, your middleweight champ. They fight at 205, while the guy that won the co-main event's hanging around, right, provided he hasn't taken a huge beating. Wouldn't that be cool? There's your selection process right there. And then the winner of that fight has to fight your co-main event winner. I know it's usually roles reversed, but you're right. Glover Teixeira and Jan Blachowicz, apart from the hardcores, you're not going to have a casual fan even sniff that pay-per-view buy.
Well, here's the problem. And before we move on, the thing that you said there in what you said lies the problem, is if those 4 fighters were on the same card, the non-title fight would be above the title fight. So the chances of Israel Adesanya fighting a heavyweight, I think, are pretty low. But I mean, I will say this: if he's ever going to fight anybody heavyweight, it'd be John Jones, who's already a small heavyweight himself. So that could work, where they're both about 220 pounds or maybe 200, around there. That would be actually fun. That'd be like a cruiserweight fight in boxing. But it just is weird that these guys are, you're going to have 2 guys fight for the belt. The reason why Adesanya's even in the conversation is because Blachowicz is not a draw.
And I mean, we'll have to see what happens, but let's keep it kind of on topic a little bit, John, because Israel Adesanya's come out in response to #SaggyPecGate and said it was because he was smoking too much, as Stephen A. Smith would say, the weed. And John, I don't know how fond you are of marijuana and how much you know about it, but several fighters have come out and said this is mad suspect. So what are your thoughts about all this one?
I'm going to keep this real brief. I don't want to say I'm not fond of marijuana because it just got legalized in Arizona, but I'm not someone who partakes in it, so I don't know anything about it. So I don't know, but I do know that a lot of people who do partake in marijuana have come out and said that's not how. Remember the old meme? That's not how it works. That's not how it works. So I'll defer to them on this, but I do think that it's the larger issue here that we're not going to talk about now because we're not there yet is if that's not true and that's the excuse that he went to, what is true? And is it what some people are speculating, like an estrogen thing with PEDs? I don't know, man. I mean, I've seen a lot of guys do a lot of PEDs, and none of them had one saggy pec. They maybe got saggy pecs after they had used it for a while and stopped, but not one, and not while they're still active fighters. Now, I don't know the extent. Now, here's the one thing that I can't figure out, which is to say, Israel Adesanya doesn't seem like a weights guy, and most like a pump and iron kind of dude, and most guys that do PEDs are. So of course Brock Lesnar's not going to get saggy pecs because he's clanging and banging like The Rock says. John Jones, same thing. Vitor Belfort, same thing. Most of these guys that do PEDs are guys that like to get shredded, and that's not really Adesanya. So that could explain something.
And I would disagree with you a little bit there on the whole PED train, because you could just be somebody that's taking EPO like TJ Dillashaw. And I mean, yeah, he's, jacked, but look at cyclists. Other than their legs, they're not super jacked up top. But my point is, I look at this and you listen to conversations, like Luke Thomas when he was on the Joe Rogan Experience or out and about on his own. Or you listen to Jeff Nowitzki when he was on Joe Rogan Experience, or when he was on Hot Boxing with Mike Tyson. See, we'd reference. When Jeff Nowitzki's been on these shows, he's kind of talked about it like, A, I don't really blame the athletes, but B, you can only get caught if we have tests for these things. And there's definitely designer drugs that are out there, right? And I would never accuse Israel Adesanya or anybody else of doing PEDs. But who's to say that there's people out there in professional sports that are taking certain concoctions of elements that are undetectable? I mean, there's one thing right there. I'm sure, again, when I grew up, when I get into baseball, first love. When I was really young was like the Mark McGuire, Sammy Sosa race. I was 4 then. But I grew up around baseball where guys were super jacked, mashing dingers, throwing balls. They were just starting to get into that 100-mile-an-hour phase. Now they're throwing them as fast as they can, and then you just replace your ligament with Tommy John, and you're back out there throwing as hard as you were before. But all that to say, I'm fine with PED use in most circumstances. I've kind of been this way for a long time. Unless we say, yep, it's an outright ban, all right, maybe don't do it. But if you can really get your hands on some of the good stuff, then why not? In this case, I have no idea. I don't know. But who doesn't want to see just juice to the gills Vitor Belfort fight like 42-year-old Lyoto Machida again? But we get like 100% Vitor and not like old man dad bod Vitor.
The thing we're going to pull from this clip is if you can get the good stuff, go ahead and do it. So let's move on. Speaking of Lyoto Machida, perfect segue. Thank you very much. The Dragon has returned, Craig. And we're not talking about the reason why I'm drinking out of Game of Thrones cup. Not Visceron. Not, what is it? What are the other ones? Visceron.
I don't know. I didn't watch the show.
Regal. Drogon. Not Lyoto Machida. This Dragon is Irish. Paul Felder is going to return from his short-lived retirement to face Rafael dos Anjos on 5 days' notice. Craig, like earlier, I'm all over the place with questions on this one. 1, did we really think Paul Felder was going to stay away? We didn't, not me and you. 2, is this a big enough fight to warrant a comeback? And 3, can we expect a retired fighter to be sharp at all on such short notice? Answer those questions. Throw them out the window. Give me your own response. Do whatever you want. Paul Felder.
I'm going to go 1 and 3 at about the same time. Do we really think Paul Felder was going to stay away? No, because it kept him in the rankings. So how retired was he? Same thing with Conor McGregor. I'm retired. Well, they kept you in the rankings. So how retired were you? To answer 3, can we expect a retired fighter to be sharp on short notice? Well, everybody's ripping poor Craig and Matt Allen on this Wednesday evening because we put out the singles videos. And, when we taped our Felder Dos Anjos prediction, the fight had just been announced. Felder's manager hadn't released any comments. Felder hadn't talked about the fights. So you had to assume, I look at Paul Felder on any given Saturday, actually I should say any given Friday, when it's weigh-in day, and he steps up on the scale as a goof and weighs in 196 pounds. So I have no idea what kind of shape Paul Felder is going to be in. Did I know he was getting ready for a triathlon? Did I know he had to cut about 15 to 20 pounds on 5 or 6 days' notice? No, I had no idea. So I had to assume it was just Paul Felder who trains, who does commentary work, who travels around the world still. And he's not necessarily getting up off the couch, but he's no spry chicken in that certain sense. So for me, I think he can still be sharp if he has been getting ready for triathlons. I mean, you saw Nate Diaz in the first fight against Conor McGregor. That's how he got it. That's what he was doing, the kind of life he was leading. Can he be sharp on such short notice? He probably can. But I mean, if you've seen the pictures of RDA getting ready for this fight, I never take Instagram into too much of an account, though I was pretty hard on Thiago Santos before last weekend because he only had 2 videos out there. And if you really look closely, they were old videos where he was doing like some spinny moves out in the park and he was doing some capoeira. And I was worried about his knees. But for Paul Felder, I expect him to be sharp. I expect RDA to be pretty sharp too. And is it a big enough fight to warrant a comeback? I mean, it's another fight night main event. If you're Paul Felder, are you ever going to get a pay-per-view main event? Are you ever going to get a pay-per-view co-main event? I don't know. I mean, I know he's in the good grace of the UFC, but to answer it, is it a big enough fight to warrant a comeback? You beat a former champ, that still holds weight. So I think it is a pretty decent fight for him to take, and I'm sure he gets a good payday, and I'm sure they're going to give him some opportune commentary gigs as well as a thank you type of present.
Yeah, I mean, he's a company man, that's for sure, and I don't say that in a derogatory way. You know, I said this a while back. I don't know, it might have been an early stoppage in the dark ages, or might have been on another podcast. But you know, I'm always fascinated by RDA, right? Because there's always the whispers about what he's injecting or has injected. But this guy, for a while I called him Anthony Anderson because Anthony Anderson was this guy who like 1 minute was like this horrible actor no one gave a shit about. And then the next thing you know, he was on Blackish and he was a leading man and all that. 1 minute, this guy's losing to Jeremy Stevens and Tyson Griffin and Clay Guida and Gleason Tebow. And the next minute, he's a world champion. Get ready to fight Conor McGregor. Red panty night. I mean, he almost had it all, this kid. So I'm fascinated. So what I mean by that is that when you come to fight RDA, it's a full night. And maybe Paul Felder's trying to write a book. They got Couch to 5K. Maybe they're going to do Couch to RDA, and he'll figure out how to get up off your ass and go fight a former world champion. I like this fight. I think that I was talking to my cousin, because I saw this great tweet and I sent it to her. She's from Philly, and somebody tweeted out. I'll have to find the tweet, but they were just talking about like a Philly fighter's willingness, or a person from Philly's willingness to fight. And the joke being that, it doesn't take much to get them to want to fight. So I wasn't surprised that he took the fight. I was kind of surprised that Dean Thomas, this is a tweet. Of course, Paul Felder going to step up to fight. Dudes from Philly will fight you over a losing lottery ticket, which is hilarious because my old man's from Philly. But, I think that if Felder and so my cousin asked me some more questions and I kind of gave her some insight. But the point of it was I said, it's a pretty steep hill to climb. He was retired, but I don't know that he's going to go in there and take the fight if he doesn't think he has a chance. Now, is it a puncher's chance, or it's a 5-round fight, Craig? It's a main event. So you're not going in there just to sort of, collect a check, and you're the first card off the prelims. You're in there for 3 rounds. You can bear down. It's 15 minutes. Maybe you run all week, get your cardio up, and you can get through it. You don't get through championship rounds on short notice unless you're doing something. Now, the triathlon stuff helps, but I'm interested in this fight. I like to watch Paul Felder fight. Over the years, I've kind of messed around with him early in his commentating career because he's made some mistakes. I happen to think he's a better commentator than fighter, but I do like to watch his fights. So I'm glad to have him back in that capacity as well.
I'm just looking forward to it. I'm glad they've got a main event like that. I'm glad they added the Brendan Allen, no relation, Sean Strickland fight onto it as well. And John, if we're talking about UFC events, it's looking like Zuffa Boxing set to hold their first event on December 11th. It's going to star Claressa Shields, who will be fighting Marie-Eve DiCarrie. Escasay prop, okay, for all 3 junior middleweight belts. John, you're more of a boxing head than I am, although the logo's got a boxing guy, and people are starting to ask questions. They're like, why is there a boxing guy there? That's for another day. But is this a worthy way to kick off Zuffa Boxing? Are you excited about this one?
Well, Claressa Shields is a champion. She's, I believe, a former gold medalist. She's got the credentials. So yeah, now here's what I think is interesting about Zuffa boxing. The more I thought about it, the fact that they're fighting for all 3 junior middleweight belts means that the MMA and boxing are different in the sense that you could be a boxing promotion and still have people fighting for the same belts that they would fight for if they fought in other promotions. So if Claressa Shields fought for Premier Boxing, or she fought for any of these other, Top Rank or whoever, she'd be fighting for those same junior middleweight belts. That does give Zuffa some instant credibility. So I guess let me pose the question to you in this way. Do you think it makes more sense for Zuffa Boxing to start their promotion with this fight, or if they could have gotten Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr.? What do you think is a better way to start?
I think this fight makes more sense.
Okay.
And the reason why, it's a big question of money. I was going to ask you a question kind of closer to the end, once we kind of get all the meat off the bone. Do you think with Canelo Alvarez being a free agent, he's free from Golden Boy and DAZN, is that somebody that UFC is going to target? But I feel like that's a stupid question. And the reason why was because Canelo was guaranteed $35 million a fight with DAZN and Golden Boy. The UFC is not going to pay that kind of money. They just won't. If they don't pay their MMA stars anywhere near that kind of money, they're not just going to start paying the new kid on the block tens of millions of dollars, because then all their MMA fighters are going to expect tens of millions of dollars. With Claressa Shields, she doesn't command that kind of money. You're not paying Claressa Shields $20 million, $25 million, not anywhere near that realm. So for Zuffa, start off with fighters that are going to be making in the hundreds of thousands or the tens of thousands. I don't think that they necessarily, should they go after a big fish? Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's the UFC to some extent, but do I expect them to? No.
You hit the nail on the head. And the nail on the head is, if you pay Canelo Alvarez's rate, whatever that is, okay, it's hard to then not pay Conor McGregor Canelo Alvarez's rate, because Conor McGregor looks at it like, I'm filling the same building that Canelo Alvarez is. Why is he getting 35 and I'm getting 15? It doesn't make sense. So here's my thought, and this is why we clip these shows. This is why when I get time, probably this summer, or maybe over the winter break, I'm going to do a better job of cataloging the shows, because you and I say things every once in a while, and we're like right on the money with certain things. And I think I'm going to be pretty close to right on the money with this thing I'm about to say, which is the thing that makes the most sense for Zuffa Boxing is to turn Zuffa Boxing into what Dana White Contender Series is. And if you could market young boxers in the way that he's marketing young MMA fighters, here's the beauty of it. You don't have to pay them. And I think that's because if Dana starts getting into bidding wars, he's going to open up a whole can of worms on the MMA side, like you said. So I think that if he can figure out a way to tap into the market of like, man, if I could get people interested in on a certain night, these boxers, the way they're interested in these MMA fighters. Now I think he's going to struggle with that a little bit, because people have tried it before, but those people did not have the profile and the cachet that Dana White has. I think it's possible, and I think that's probably the smartest way to go. Because if you try to get in a bidding war, it's just too many bad things are going to happen. One, you don't know if your business will be sustainable, and two, your other thing. Now, the other thing nobody's talking about is, how does this affect the UFC? Because in the past, I'll use a kind of off the wall example, but like Lorne Michaels, right? Lorne Michaels is the executive producer of Saturday Night Live. Well, he was also the executive producer of 30 Rock, and he was also the executive producer of Jimmy Fallon. So now all those things happen in the same building, which is 30 Rockefeller Plaza in New York. So that helps. But as you start to get pulled away, I brought up the Game of Thrones thing. People say the reason why season 8 of Game of Thrones was bad was because the co-creators already moved on to the next project. So is Dana White's preoccupation with Zuffa Boxing doing well, which he will be preoccupied with that, does that mean Sean Shelby moves more into the forefront? Someone else sort of take the visible reins? That's going to be interesting to see.
It will be. I mean, like, you can compare this to a lot of different companies that choose to diversify. Once you start pulling yourself away from one thing, obviously you're not going to have enough time for the other. So that is a really good question. And then not necessarily will there be cross promotion, But will there be cross promotion in terms of if I watch a Zuffa boxing event, assuming it's going to be on UFC Fight Pass, what night do you have it? Do you have it Friday night, and then do you market that Saturday fight night card heavily? Like, will they market Zuffa boxing heavily on the UFC events? Because there's a lot of MMA fans out there that aren't boxing fans, and vice versa.
You know what I'd like to see, honestly? I'd like to see Friday night boxing, Saturday night MMA. That'd be cool. Maybe in the same venue. Maybe you go to Madison Square Garden, the MMA's on Saturday, and you do the other, the Hulu theater that the PFL or World Series of Fighting or whoever used to go into. That's where you do the boxing match, depending on how it draws. Maybe you just put a boxing ring in there on Friday night, if you get a big enough fight. All right, Craig, let's move on. Sparring sessions. So before the real hardcore tough guys out there that listen to us start calling me a snowflake or a cuck, I want to give this segment some context. I mean, I am a snowflake and a cuck, but no one wants to be called that in the comments. The context here is that some brands thrive as counter-programming. The example would be Rush Limbaugh and Fox News rose to prominence during Bill Clinton's time in office, not George Bush's. Pretty much by bashing Clinton. So that brings me to the question for sparring sessions this week. Is the UFC better off if Joe Biden is president or if Donald Trump is?
Well, I don't think you're ever going to see Joe Biden at a UFC event, ever. But other than that, with, being a Canadian and not delving into American politics, all I'll say is, I mean, if you're a big UFC fan, I remember getting the media emails from the UFC, and one of them was Donald Trump's introduction for which pay-per-view was it? I want to say, was it Masvidal Diaz? Was it the BMF one?
I think so.
Or what? No, it was at the start of the year. It was in the spring. It was during the pandemic. It was when the UFC was coming back, and there was a video of him in front of the White House where he said, "Congratulations to Dana White and the UFC for coming back," and so on and so forth.
Oh, yeah. You mean the introduction? I thought you were the one he went to.
Yeah, the introduction. So, when you can play off of that as a brand, that's great. I mean, I don't know. Let's say you're Kleenex or I've got a Bath and Body Works candle. If you have somebody that's famous that goes, geez, I like this Bath and Body Works candle, and it didn't cost you anything for them to say it, and they're, big in the public spotlight, it's probably a pretty good thing to have that endorsement, I would think. So for the UFC to have the endorsement they did over the past, 4 years, but really the last 2, we've seen a little bit more. I mean, it's not negative. I don't think it'd be overly negative. I don't think it matters who the president is. It could be Joe Biden. It could be Donald Trump. It could be George Bush. It could be whoever, Barack Obama. If you have a president or a person that's sitting in office that's promoting your brand for free, that's pretty good for you. So I would say it's probably better if they still had a guy that showed up to their events and made them a little bit more high profile. I don't know. Maybe Joe Biden is an MMA fan. Andrew Yang's an MMA fan. There's a senator in the States that wants to push the Ali Act that's not Andrew Yang, that's a Republican. If you had him going to the events, I wish I knew his name. I'll have to look it up. That could be good for you. If you have high-profile MMA fans showing up, I mean, it's definitely a good thing. I don't know if Donald Trump watches MMA religiously. I have no idea. But I would say for the UFC, just having that relationship where your president is in well with your sitting president, that's a good thing. So do I expect Dana White to maybe approach Joe Biden to try and get his blessing? You never know. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess the approach I'm taking here is that, with Jorge Masvidal campaigning for President Trump and with Kobe Covington basically turning his whole gimmick into a MAGA bro, if Trump is no longer in the White House, does Kobe have to scrap that gimmick, or does it actually work better if Joe Biden's the president, where he sticks with it and he's like, we had it right for 4 years and now you snowflakes elected this guy, kind of like pro wrestling where, the Iron Sheik works because he's countered to Hulk Hogan. And, I guess that's the part where I'm with you that it completely makes sense to have the access to the White House. That you can't, Kobe Covington getting a phone call from Donald Trump after beating Tyron Woodley, you can't put a price tag on that. Kobe Covington taking a picture in front of the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, you can't put a price tag on that. So I guess that's what I'm wondering is do those gimmicks go away, Or do those guys just sort of like, I mean, obviously the whole UFC is not Kobe Covington. So if he has to change his gimmick, so be it. But yeah, so you're I guess it's your contention that no matter who the president is, they're fine. But having a high profile, quote unquote, fan is probably good for the brand.
That's where I'm going with it. I don't know. Again, I don't know. I don't live in your country. I miss your country, but I don't live in it.
Our country misses you. Let's talk about a new segment, Craig. It's new segment time. So crank up the old tapology as we're going to talk about when fighters should have left the sport. We're going to write the end of their careers Hollywood style in a new segment we're calling the Curtain Call, Pride Edition. We're going to start with Pride. I'll give you some fighters. You tell me when you think they should have walked away. Let's start with Rampage Jackson.
Right after Vanderlei Silva 4. That's when he should have retired, right? You didn't have 3. 3 wasn't enough. You needed 4. I mean, if you have a look at his record, he lost to 3 in the UFC, 2013, Jones, Bader, Glover. Should he have retired then? Maybe. But then he went on to finish Joey Beltran and Christian Mpumbu. And then he beat King Mo. And then he beat Fabio Maldonado. And then Satoshi Ishii. I would say probably after losing to Chael Sonnen in 2018 was probably time to hang it up. And I mean, you could argue with me and say, well, 5 years before that, he lost 3 fights in a row. But he's still a big enough name, still a big enough draw. I'd say once you lose to Chael Sonnen at 265 pounds, that's when you retire.
No. So let me rephrase this for you because that's a great answer. That's a great answer, but it's not the one I was necessarily looking for.
Okay.
Meaning, if you can have that Hollywood moment where you walk away, what's the fight to walk away on? Not do you still have more to give? I'll give you an example. I think he puts his gloves in the cage after he beats Mo Lawal, even by decision at Bellator 120. He retires pretty satisfied. Now now listen. Here's the issue there. There's still cash. There's still checks to cash. It's a big Lawal check on the rematch. It's a big check against Chael, a big check against Vanderlei, and a big check against Fedor. So I understand why he didn't. But for his legacy, putting him down on the mat after Lawal probably would have done him some good.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because, I mean, like, even if you go all the way back to the Henderson fight, like, you win the belt, but you're still in your heyday, I guess. So you still want more, right? Yeah, I think, yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, there's so many good fights there. Like, even the Jared, the time, what about it when he knocked out Vanderlei? But again, he still had more to give. That was 2008. When did the 18 movie come out?
That's the question. Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess the way to look at it would be, we can't look at it like the 18 movie came out in 2010. You can't look at it like well, he would have never fought Chael, he would never done, because those fights don't exist if he retires. So when would these fighters have retired and been content with having retired? Not that there's more left to do, because he never needed to fight Chael. He never needed to really fight Vanderlei again. Fedor, I get. And, I mean, he'd already beaten Mo Lawal. All right, let's move on to Vanderlei Silva, the aforementioned Vanderlei Silva, the axe murderer, who was a complete annihilator in Pride. When do you think Vanderlei should have set him on the ground?
This is an easy one for me. So UFC on Fuel TV 8, when he went back to Japan, he had that one last UFC fight against Brian Stan, and he beat him. And he finished him in the second round. That's when he should have retired. Because after that, he fought twice and he lost twice.
I agree. That's a good way to go out. I mean, you could have made an argument after Chuck, but he still had some good fights in there with other guys. There was still some stuff left to do. He really hadn't been like a UFC fighter necessarily. The Chuck fight was a great fight. It was his first fight in the UFC, a fight we waited for a long time, but he lost it. So, he went on a run. You could make an argument for after Kung Lee. But I like your call. I like the after he beat Brian Stinks. That was such a great fight. Okay. Shogun Rua is a tough one.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
This is a tough one because again, this is like my guy, and he's on like a quiet little win streak right now. I guess. I mean, he's 5-1 and 1 draw in his last 7 fights. When could Shogun have retired? Well, I mean, he was a champ, right? He beat Machida, then he lost to Jones. Maybe. I don't know, either when he beat Vera or Forrest Griffin. I guess Forrest Griffin, because, I mean, then you beat a former champ. and he could have called it, but like he's still halfway competitive now. It's weird. He's a really weird one.
He's a very weird one because he goes on these long strings of losses, and then he kind of like sandwiches them in there with guys you wouldn't even care that he fought. Like when he fought James Tahuna, who cares? When he fought Little Nog, who really cares? I mean, I know that people do. Split decision win over Corey Anderson, okay, maybe. But going out on a Corey Anderson win, and then he fights Jean Vellante, probably should have never fought him. I mean, listen, I will give Jean Vellante fight a vote only because it's him winning and it's a finish. So, but I'm with you, man. It's all over the map.
Like even that Tyson Pedro finish was fluky because Pedro was all over him, and then he hurt his knee, and then Shogun took over because Pedro was compromised. Like his little run here, like remember the Anthony Smith fight? Like that was the rise of Anthony Smith, and like we're gonna have a new little recording area here in the office. I took a video and put it out on Instagram. I've got here. Let's do this. I've got the Anthony Smith Volkan Oezdemir poster now, and you can see my light. But that was like the rise of Anthony Smith. That's UFC Moncton there. But like Shogun walked out crying. It was so weird. And then he got finished quick. So for me, like I said, I mean, I'd go a little bit earlier. I'd say probably Vera, Forrest Griffin. But I mean, that was 2011. He's still fighting 9 years later.
That's where it gets weird. I think the only two real choices are Forrest Griffin if you go early. It sucks because we don't get the two Henderson fights. But now here's the problem. I can't say that you can't talk about fights that wouldn't have happened if you retired on the one hand, not the other. So either Forrest Griffin or Jean Vellante for me. All right, up next, Big Nog.
Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. Tough one. I mean, would you say after Verdum, or maybe after he avenged the loss to Josh Barnett, or maybe when he beat Tim Sylvia? I mean, when he beat Tim Sylvia, then he fought for the belt against Frank Mir, and then after that, he fought Randy Couture. Maybe Randy Couture.
I think Couture's where you go.
Because I mean, you look at the fight against Velasquez wasn't for a belt, so yeah, Couture.
The problem with that is, I think that was I thought that was a title fight. I guess it wasn't. I think Couture's probably where you hang it up. Because really after that, and again, we can't play the after it game, but yeah, I think if you're gonna going out, at the time, this is 2009. At the time, you can make an argument: best heavyweight in the UFC versus the best heavyweight in Pride history, and you won it. So that's to me when you walk away. Yeah, I think Randy Couture's a kind of a no-brainer. All right, let's talk about Lil Nog, Rogerio. When should Antonio Rogerio Nogueira have hung it up?
After he knocked out Sam Alvey in 2018 when he was a plus 310 underdog. I still remember that fight, and I still can't believe that it happened. Like, the guy right now is 44 years old, so then he would have been, what? He would have just turned 42. That's when you retire. On a knockout win, that's it.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, that or Patrick Cummins, but he did have a night. He beat Tito and Rashad back to back. That wouldn't have been a bad time to go out. But in all reality, you can't beat those two guys back to back and not think you have more to give. I think, like you said, after you lose to Anthony Johnson, after you lose to Shogun, who beat Cummins, lose to Bader, now it's like, okay, this is going to be a hit or miss kind of career from here on out. I think you knock Alvey's head off and then you walk off into the distance. All right, let's talk about I threw this one in here. You know what? Let's do the throw in last. Dan Henderson, because Dan Henderson's a little more closely associated with Pride than and Anderson Silva's gonna be our last one, but he's Anderson Silva, I think, in people's mind is more associated as a UFC fighter. Henderson might actually be split between Pride and UFC. So we're talking about Dan Henderson. When do you think he should have walked away?
So I look at Dan Henderson like on his way back to the UFC. So he beat Babalu, he beat Cavalcante, he beat Fedor, and then he beat Shogun when he came back to the UFC. And then he lost to Machida, Rashad Evans, and Belfort, and then he knocked out Shogun in 2014, right there. Because after that, he lost to Cormier, he lost to Mousasi, beat Boach, lost to Belfort, and so on and so forth. And I know he got a title shot in his very last fight, but to me, it's the Shogun fight where he finished him at, what was it? It was a main event. Didn't win fight of the night. I think it won fight of the night. 22nd greatest comeback of all time in Tapology. 5th greatest knockout, or 5th best knockout of 2014. 5th best fight of 2014. Fight of the night and performance of the night bonuses.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to do better than that fight. So yeah, I'm with you. I think that's probably when he should have called it quits, because that's a tough fight to beat. So we'll stick with that one. And again, all the stuff that came after it, you wouldn't have known. But if you had to say, okay, if I stopped here, because in reality, except for Bisping, nothing else that happened after that fight was unfinished business. And in reality, you probably could have, if he really wanted to, he probably could have booked a fight with Bisping right after that Hua fight if he wanted to. So, all right. Actually, you know what? Let me take that back, because what I just said makes no sense. He did not have unfinished business with Bisping, because he's the one that knocked Bisping out in UFC 100. So Hua winning, him beating Hua, there's nothing left on the table. After that was all guys he either never fought, or, I mean, they're interesting matchups, but they weren't necessary. All right, let's go ahead and wrap it up with Anderson Silva. He has, he's in the running for the greatest of all time. He had a brief career in Pride, certainly not what he's known for. When do you think Anderson Silva should have hung him up?
It is tough, right? Like, I mean, right off the top of the head, I think, geez, do you retire after the Derek Brunson fight because that was the last win? Or do you go all the way back to, UFC 183? That one's tough because he wins the fight, but then it gets overturned to a no contest because of the USADA issues, anabolic steroids. So I don't know. I really don't have a good answer for that one.
I'm with you on the Brunson. So if everything played out the way it played out, obviously, I'd go Derek Brunson, because you'd lost so many in a row that you got a clear indication that you cannot operate at the highest levels. Now, the weird part is the fight before Derek Brunson was Daniel Cormier. So he took a fight on short notice at light heavyweight against one of the greatest wrestlers of all time and got wrestled. So for him, it's kind of like, well, I don't know if I could still exist in my world anymore just because I got out-wrestled at a weight class up by one of the greatest MMA wrestlers of all time. So I can understand the curiosity, but losing to Weidman twice, losing to Bisping. The Bisping thing was interesting because, he pretty much knocked Bisping out there at the bell. Could have been given the victory, I guess. Bisping did answer the bell, but that was a tricky one. Had he knocked out Bisping, maybe that's where you shut it down. But in the way that it played out, Derek Brunson. All right, guys, let's move on to For the Gram. Craig, Mike Winklejohn, John Jones' coach, said that John Jones shouldn't chase Israel Adesanya. I'm going to give you the quote and give me your thoughts. It's a long one, but we'll get through it quickly. My first thought is heavyweight. Have Israel come with the heavyweight. Here's the deal. John Jones has always fought a who's who, and it's always been this guy. You have to go beat this guy to secure your legacy. And then he beats him, and then it's okay. You have to beat this guy to secure your legacy. He beats him. John doesn't need to chase anybody. They need to chase him. That's the way I look at it. That's why he's the best, so probably heavyweight. John's current mindset is to get to heavyweight. That makes sense. Once he puts all that mass on, there's no reason to come back down. What's the purpose of that? Go back down to chase Izzy? Absolutely not. John's the man. He's the greatest. People need to chase him. He's a leader. He's a leader of the sport. Do you agree with Mike Winklejohn?
No, not at all. I mean, he's standing up for his guy, right? But if you're Israel Adesanya, you don't jump all the way up to heavyweight to fight John Jones. There's got to be a happy medium. You're at your optimal weight at 185. And I mean, we've seen Israel Adesanya weigh in 183. So for him to make the move to light heavyweight is a stretch. For him to make the move up to at least, like you said, at the very start of the show, 225 pounds or more, he's going to be at it's going to be such an unfair advantage to John Jones having all that experience at 205 and then at 265. I mean, would Adesanya slow down a lot? If he goes all the way up to heavyweight, how does that affect his future performances at middleweight? Will it affect him making weight again? We already talked about hashtag saggy Peckgate or whatever. So I worry about that. I think it's got to be light heavyweight. Heavyweight doesn't make a lot of sense for Adesanya. And if you're Mike Winklejohn, again, you're adding smoke to the fire, but you're really helping your guy out. For Adesanya, it just doesn't make sense.
I know John's decided to go to heavyweight, and I respect that. And now if Adesanya wants to have the fight, he could have given John a lot more attention when the fight was really getting serious along the way, when John was a 205-pound fighter. He wasn't talking about heavyweight in a serious way. Like he wasn't vacating belts and all that. I think this is a little bit moving the goalposts. Now it's odd for me because, listen, you were a 205-pound fighter for a lot of years, and now you're at heavyweight, but this guy came up to your weight class. So if you want to fight him, he's there for you. So you got to give it a little bit. Now, and he's going out and getting the belt. So I think if Adesanya goes up 205 and wins the belt, I think John should go fight him at 205. But I do think, in fairness to John, he should get a heavyweight title shot before that. So let this whole thing play itself out. I think if Adesanya wins the 205-pound belt, he should go back down, defend 85, come back up and fight John. Speaking of that, though, speaking of chasing guys, let's talk about one Twitter hitter. Jones said he won't chase Adesanya, but Robert Whittaker seems to say that he will. Whittaker came out this week and said if he has to follow stop under 205 pounds, he will. Your thoughts?
I would only want to see Whittaker Adesanya, not Whittaker have to fight Rakic, Smith, Santos, Teixeira, any of those guys. Like, I would just want to see Whittaker and Adesanya fight for, I don't know, would you get both belts? You'd only really get one of them. But if Adesanya had a 205-pound belt. But yeah, I don't want to see Whittaker up at light heavyweight. He's not a giant middleweight. He's a big guy for sure, but he's not the biggest middleweight. Look at Paulo Costa. Look at Yoel Romero. So for me, I'm fine if it's a one-off, but for Robert Whittaker to want to take fights at 205, no dice.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say Robert Whittaker cleaned out the division when he was the champion, but 205 kind of interests me. And I would kind of like to see guys go up in weight when they don't have to, when it's not like I'm on a 5-fight losing streak, so let me try this weight class. So it'd be interesting from that perspective. But, yeah, I would prefer to see those two fight at 85 just because I don't think Whittaker was all the way there the first time they fought. I'd like to see, and it kind of like, obviously not as much time has passed, but Poirier and McGregor. If Adesanya and Whittaker fought again, there's nothing in the first fight that gave me evidence that would be different, but everything else about Robert Whittaker gives me evidence that it might be different. So it'll be interesting at 85. All right, Craig was on to posting the book. Craig's sad news this week is Mark the Hammer Coleman was hospitalized this week after a heart attack. The former UFC heavyweight and ultimate winner is in good spirits, but okay shape. Listen, we're not here to write a eulogy on the guy, and we're certainly not trying to put him in the ground at all. But what's your favorite Mark Coleman memory?
Insert a clip from a very early Fight Night Picks podcast episode where I had the one and only New York badass Phil Baroni on. And John, I don't care what Phil Baroni's Twitter looks like these days. And I'm not reading this off of anywhere. Like, growing up, I thought Phil Baroni was the coolest guy in the world because he was yoked up and he was knocking out Dave Manet. And I still love watching that clip now. But my favorite Mark Coleman moment was at Pride 31 when he fought Shogun Rua. And I asked Phil Baroni about this, but do you remember what happened in that fight?
Didn't Shogun break his arm?
Mark Coleman got him down. Shogun broke his arm. He spins around in pain, and then pandemonium breaks out. Vanderlei Silva runs into the ring. Phil Baroni gets him down. They're wrestling around on the ground. Mark Coleman, people are holding him back. But for Mark Coleman to beat Shogun in that moment, it was pretty cool. And then he would lose to Fedor later on that year. And then he'd lose to Shogun 3 years later. And that was kind of a sad fight because Mark Coleman didn't look like he had a whole ton to give. And then he would fight a couple more times. But I was never a huge Mark Coleman fan just because it was way before my time. But obviously I have gone back. I've watched him at UFC 11. I've rewatched UFC 12 and 14 when he lost to Maurice Smith. But for me, it was just that moment because I was always such a big Phil Baroni guy and a Vanderlei Silva guy and a Shogun Rua guy. But I mean, overall, I mean, wish nothing but the best for Mark Coleman in recovering from this as well.
Quick Phil Baroni story. When I was much, much younger, I would go to have a few drinks and cause quite a ruckus in my younger days. So Pride 33, I think, was the real deal. It was the one when they did it in Vegas. And they did an open workout. Phil Baroni was in there sparring, and I had a few, and I was next to the ring yelling at Phil Baroni, and he gassed out in the fight. He's yelling at me, and we're going back and forth. So fortunately for me, Phil Baroni did decide That was the day he wanted to kick some random's ass because he would have came out and probably cleaned me up real quick. But here's my favorite. I have a lot of Mark Coleman history. Mark Coleman was one of the first fighters I ever met in Vegas and took a picture with. The funny thing was, we were in, if you go to MGM, I think it's MGM or Mandalay. It was Mandalay Bay. As you're going to the arena, there's a ramp and it kind of slopes up. And I said, hey, Mark, can I get a picture? I had a buddy of mine with me. And he made sure that he stood on the side that was sloping up, so I wasn't taller than him in the picture, which I thought was funny. It's the first instance I saw of like fighter vanity. But listen, there's a lot of things with Mark Coleman where you kind of thought the story was over and he extended it. I mean, he was the first guy. I thought Don Fry was like God's gift to fighting when I was first started watching UFC, and Coleman just worked him. And then Coleman fought Maurice Smith, got tired out, and Maurice Smith took the belt. Then he fought Pete Williams. Pete Williams kicked his head into the next stratosphere. And, here's the thing that's always been a recurring theme with Mark Coleman. He was one of the first fighters to follow me, and we'd interacted here and there, and I talked to him about I want to do a bigger project with him, so it never really came to fruition, but like the fight between him and Pete Williams got inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. I was there. Mark Coleman came out and spoke on it. This is probably one of the worst moments of his fighting career. And he kind of was out humbly saying, yeah, it was a big night for Pete. And here's the thing, Craig, that you got to understand about a guy like Mark Coleman. If Mark Coleman doesn't show, it kind of takes away from Pete Williams' moment a little bit. He showed up to kind of put Pete Williams over so that they're both at this thing. Maybe Dana White doesn't even put the fight in if Mark Coleman doesn't agree to show. So the last thing that I will say is a moment that sticks out for me when it comes to Mark Coleman is the fact that he won the Pride Heavyweight Grand Prix when everyone had written him off. And, this is before, there was pay-per-view, but Pride packaged this thing in this great DVD case, and it had the Sakuraba Royce Gracie fight, and then it had this, and he beat Vocic. I mean, that was a stacked lineup, that Pride Heavyweight Grand Prix. And just when you thought his career was over, he gave it to you one more time. And that's what I remember about Coleman. He's always been this guy who sort of rose to the occasion. He's had his ups and downs, but he doesn't get talked about as much as he should in terms of greatest heavyweights of all time because he gassed out against Maurice Smith and because Pete Williams kicked him in the head. So on his worst nights, he had some bad nights. But on his best nights, he was the best fighter in the world. So, yeah. So here's hoping the quick recovery for the hammer. And when he's feeling better, maybe we'll have him on and do a big interview with him, put it on the channel. All right, Craig, let's move on to start the conversation. It kind of has a little bit to do with Mark Coleman, which is we've talked in previous episodes about, this whole thing of Anderson Silva being eased into retirement and the transition and all that. So with that, the way things have gone for BJ Penn and the news we just talked about with Mark Coleman, this is not the first health issue Mark Coleman's had. It's not the first money issue he's had regarding his health. I think he needed either hip or knee surgery a while ago when he couldn't afford it. So people were starting GoFundMes and all that. What should the UFC be doing for retiring or retired fighters? What should the plan be?
I mean, when you're a hockey player, when you're a football player, when you're a baseball player, does the NFL, MLB, or NHL pay for it? No, they don't necessarily. I mean, you still get some team coverage in terms of insurance, but usually, doesn't the Players Association have a little bit more to do with it than anything?
You talking about the healthcare and all that?
Yeah. Yeah,
they do. I mean, the teams, it's the teams pay into the coffer or whatever for the pensions and healthcare and all that stuff.
And I mean, there's a union there to kind of bargain on behalf of the athletes. That's where I have to go with all this. I mean, does the UFC owe it to fighters, especially like Mark Coleman? Mark Coleman, prime example, and especially the way that you had ended posting to the book. This is a guy that's not really recognized as much as he probably should be. And he's definitely one of those fighters that I would say is like an icon of the sport, like BJ Penn, like Royce Gracie, like Randy Couture. He's one of those guys that definitely needs to be respected. But what if it was, like you said, let's say it was Pete Williams that needed or just had a heart attack? Or what if it's somebody like Tank Abbott when he had liver issues? Should the UFC help those guys out? Do they have an obligation to help those guys out? I think if you had a union in place, somebody that could bargain on behalf of the fighters that we have now, because fighters from 20, 25 years ago, fighters that have only had 1 or 2 fights in the UFC, it's tough. It really is. But for that next generation of fighters that really want to see themselves, stay with the company for a long time, that's what everybody wants, but to make a lot of money in MMA and to be able to have a good life after fighting, they definitely need to help themselves and set themselves up well, especially with the healthcare coverage, medical coverage once you're retired. Pension's a little difficult, but a pension. I don't know what the UFC should do for retiring or retired fighters. I know they really like to go a little bit, kind of overboard with, what is it, the fighter retreat and International Fight Week, and they make that a big thing. But does it really amount to anything, or is it just like everybody gets to feel warm and fuzzy that they were invited to this and they were part of the UFC? Like, does that help you out when you break your foot? You can't pay for it because you live in the United States with your weird healthcare. I don't know. I really don't know. The Canadian fighters don't have to worry about this as much as the American fighters, so I can't really comment on it that way. But I really think in terms of the fighters that are here and now, you guys really got to look into this whole unionization thing, especially regarding pay, but also so you're not down the road and you don't run into issues like this.
100%. And I think the issue really becomes the union, like you said, because where this gets weird is if you are Dana White in the UFC, you have a lot of decisions to make. Do you do things in one-off situations that look good for PR, like you said, fighter retreats and all these things look good for PR? Oh, we take care of fighters because they show up to this retreat and the food's taken care of and the lodging's taken care of and all that. I think that so it looks on the outside like they're doing it, but in reality, what they're doing is suppressing a union and the rights by picking these things off individually, and that way it doesn't seem like an issue. There's no bad PR hit of some fighter who's broke and in other sports, they have like bird rights, where if you've been in the league for a certain amount of time, but they have schedules, meaning if you're still playing effectively and this has been collectively bargained, they're gonna be like, all right, this guy's been in the league 10 years, it's 5 with the same team. He's going to get a kick in his pay or whatever rights come with these bird rights because of this, right? But there's nobody's going to say, oh man, this guy's getting close with bird rights, let's cut him, because they want to win. So if the guy's productive, they're going to keep him on the team. I think if the UFC had fighters who were approaching pensions, they would say, well, we don't need to give him a fight. Or let's say, for example, it's something like, if you're a UFC fighter and a guy like Matt Brown would fall into this, right? Where you've got some performance bonuses, you've been in some good fights, you've just stayed in the UFC forever, but you never really made like a title run per se. Clay Guida would be another guy. So now let's say the rule is if you're in the UFC for 5 years and you've had 10 fights, right? It's 2 fights a year, then that means that you're entitled to X, Y, and Z. So then if you're the UFC and this guy's approaching that, do you then say, well, we don't really, do you find reasons to sort of circumvent that? I don't know. I don't know how the UFC would handle that. Obviously, there's no way for the league to control that, the teams to control that. The teams could just, they could have a guy with bird rights, but they could just cut him if they don't want to pay him because he's not productive. But there wouldn't be like a way where you just make it harder for the guy to get to the goal, like the UFC could. So I don't know, man. The answer to it all is unionization, but I don't know exactly how you would sort of hash all that out, but something needs to be done. And maybe, honestly, we've talked about this in the past, maybe the answer is just the expansion of the UFC PI. And it just becomes this massive structure, almost like the ESPN campus, where like it wouldn't be that crazy that there's dorms in there. And if you have a fighter who's tough on his luck, listen, I was in the military. We talked about this earlier. If you deploy somewhere, there's dorms, right? And there's a different level of dorms depending on your rank, right? So if you've been with the UFC for 2 fights and you're like, listen, I can't pay my bills, I can't, pay for a trainer. UFC says, okay, come here, live here, and then you train as UFC PI. So then they are housed in a certain dorm. But if you're Mark Coleman and you've retired from the UFC and you're a former champion, then you should have different living space than that. Right. And I think there's a way to do that. I think, I don't always say the military is the model for everything, but there are some places in the military where you could adopt certain things, even in the U.S. government. Like I had proposed a while ago, like for teachers, right? I'm a teacher as well. But when you're in the military, you get an allowance for your housing and you get an allowance for your food. So they give you, like, depending on your rank, $800 for housing and whatever, $400 or $300 for food. Why not give that to teachers? If you gave those two things to teachers, I'm sure they complain about their pay a lot less. Now, how much would it cost to do that? Probably a lot. But I'm saying the question becomes, Craig, are there more teachers than military members in the United States? Who knows? But that'd be, that's where you'd have to figure it out. So the fact remains, I think the UFC PI, either if I'm the UFC, you have two choices. If you expand the UFC PI, you don't have to worry about unionization, I think.
I would agree. I mean, I shake my head in agreement. I would agree. And then you figure out what works in Vegas. Well, then you've already got a performance institute in China where you really want to start developing talent before fighters from China, like more fighters from China make it to the UFC. And I'm sure you're that's going to be a hub, just like the UFC PI in the States could be a hub for fighters from Mexico, could be a hub for fighters from Canada. If you have a PI that's in China, maybe you get fighters from, I don't know, South Korea, from Malaysia, maybe end up with some fighters from the Philippines that end up kind of flocking to that PI just because it's a bit of a hub. Then you set one up in Europe, and then you have a European hub, and then you continue to attract talent and do it that way. And then, I mean, it's like, hey, I couldn't pay my bills in, let's say, Canada, but if I go down to Vegas and the UFC sponsors me to at least live for a time in the States, train there, I get to save a little bit of money. In the long run, that person's going to be a lot happier than, geez, I can't afford my food in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. I can barely afford to hop on a flight to get to the spot. Or maybe you end up, remember when this happened to Tim Johnson? He had a fight against Marcelo Golm in Brazil. And he's like, man, I'd love to bring more cornermen, but I can only afford to bring 2 people with me. And everybody felt pretty bad for him. Like, it's one of those spots where, yeah, there's definitely opportunities where the UFC could kind of pick up their socks and help some people out. But I think you're right. If they wanted to really try and avoid that huge hot button topic of unionization, just continue to branch out the PI and treat your fighters pretty well as good as gold, as long as they're in the confines of your promotion.
I'll end on this. There's a lot more people in the UFC than there is in the Dallas Mavericks, for example, to individual teams. But if you'd use that model and you said, okay, we have to, because you're kind of doing this anyway a little bit, the Dallas Mavericks have a plane. So if you look, what I'm saying is, if you looked at the UFC like it was a franchise of another sport, right? It was a team of another sport. What would you do? Like, would you have a training facility? Yes, you would. Would you have, now obviously all the basketball players have their own place, but could you afford, meaning if you just expanded the size of the PI, like I said earlier, then everything is one bill. That might be a high bill, but your Wi-Fi is one bill, your electric's one bill, your all these, because it's all under one network. It's a thought. All right, guys, there you have it. Yep, this episode of Early Stoppage on the Fight Night Picks Global Network is in the books. Be sure and comment under the video to let us know what you'd like to see next from the show here on YouTube, but also on iTunes and Spotify. Craig can be followed at Craig Allen FNP. I can be followed at SM Cornerman. The fight has been stopped. We'll see you next week. Craig, say something witty.
Let's get into it.